Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 58 of war in Ukraine, and this is the first week of April 2023. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about the severe battles of Bakhmut and recent updates, and we'll talk about the Russian army problems and what they're experiencing at the moment. As of today, April 8th, Ukraine has three epicenters of fierce fighting. The Russian occupying forces are concentrating their main effort on conducting offensive actions in the Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka directions. These towns remain at the epicenter of hostilities, said the Central Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Over the past 24 hours, the defense forces of Ukraine have repelled more than 60 attacks. At the same time, in the last couple of days, the number of attacks over Ukrainian lines decreased significantly. The new trend of Russian strategy shows that the occupiers started concentrating more on building the defense lines for the possible Ukraine counteroffensive. Still, the larger concentration in fighting by the Russian forces is in Bakhmut city. The Russian army definitely has some issues. Personally, I see three resources in which Russia is limited today. The first is human. Any war requires professionals to be successful. The Russians lost their military elite very badly when they marched in February 2022, as well as in March and April. For example, in Gostomel, in the first week of invasion, they lost their elite units, the preparation of which takes usually 10 to 15 years. We made many Russian pilots incapable of flying, and this is also a resource that is difficult to restore in a year or two. The second resource is the high tech weapons. Of course, sanctions do not allow to completely block the supply of chips to Russia, but they are not able to produce rockets in sufficient quantity. This is already visible in the density of shelling. They even got into the irreducible stockpile of missiles and depleted some types of them to 10% only, and in the strategic stockpile should be about 30%. The only thing they still have is S-300 missiles. They have approximately 6,000 of them, but they use them on a ballistic trajectory and are able to terrorize the Kharkiv region and the region near to the Russian borders. And the third resource, fortunately, they also begin to hunger for projectiles. We observed the number of their shots from various types of heavy artillery of all millimeters and calibers. Early, they poured up around 60,000 shells on our heads daily. Now, the front line has definitely narrowed, and they also began to hit less, and approximately between 20 and 30,000 shells per day. Intelligence reports and our partners also confirmed that during the year they run to North Korea, China, and other countries specifically for artillery shells and armored vehicles. They even removed all heavy weapons from the Belarus and redirected them to the front lines of Bakhmut. According to the leader of the Russian criminal mercenaries, Prigozhin, in order to have a positive dynamic, the Russian army needs to solve three issues: make sure that they have well organized command, check the protection of the flanks, and have sufficient deliveries of shells from the Russian government. As we know, Yevgeny Prigozhin has been constantly complaining about deficit of weapons deliveries to his army due to some political conflict with the Russian Ministry of Defense. So most of analysts blaming Prigozhin for those conflicts, due to his huge ambitions to become a bigger political figure in Russia and run for president seat in 2024. As you might know, Prigozhin is a former convict who spent years in prison for several crimes. As you see, Russia doesn't change. Russia is run by mafia and typical criminals. So the head of Russian private army Wagner Group Prigozhin admitted that the armed forces of Ukraine are not retreating from Bakhmut. It must be clearly said that Ukrainians are not going anywhere, he said. They have an organized defense inside the city, first along the railway tracks, then in the area of high rise buildings in the western quarter of the city. As you might know, Russians took part of Bakhmut, but all the claims that they control the city is totally fake. Positional work continues in the city. The situation is constantly changing. It is difficult to talk about the ratio of controlled territory, said Serhiy Cherevati, the representative of the Eastern Group of Troops of the Ukraine Armed Forces. According to him, half of the city is controlled by the forces of Ukraine and the other half by the Russians. Street fighting continues where both parties pushing each other back and forth trying to win just a block of the city. Sometimes a week of severe fighting results in liberating at approximately 100 meters or 110 yards of territory. In fierce battles, the armed forces of Ukraine have already repelled the Russian offensive in the winter. Now it's Ukraine's turn to go on the offensive. There are several signs that it will happen in the next month or so, several military analysts said. New Western weapons are arriving in Ukraine that could prove decisive in offensive, including German Leopard 2 tanks and American mine clearance vehicles. Thousands of recruits are being trained in newly formed offensive units. The new campaign will be a test for Ukraine forces' ability to rearm and rebuild battalions while maintaining the motivation and maneuverability that gave it the upper hand in the previous counteroffensive. The director of the MCK Institute, Evelyn Farkas, said, if weapons and trained troops appear in time, Ukraine is capable of inflicting losses on the Russians, which would have important geopolitical consequences. She assumed a once unthinkable result. Ukraine can make the Russian Federation a weakened military state that has no leverage in negotiations to end the war. However, the success of the counteroffensive still cannot be guaranteed. Let's be honest. The Allies are delaying the shipments of weapons, and soldiers have to settle for intensive training courses in assault tactics. And maintaining the morale of the fighters, as many believe, is becoming an increasingly difficult task. As I mentioned, Moscow is preparing Crimea for defense as well. In the occupied peninsula, Russians are actively setting up defenses, making the peninsula one of the most fortified territories in the war zone. This is evidenced by satellite images of the American company Maxar Technologies. The images show defense structures appeared in Crimea in just a few weeks against the background of news about the possible counteroffensive by Ukrainians. Some of them were erected by the occupiers in a matter of days. The enemy is strengthening the northern part of the occupied peninsula and the coast. Ukrainian armed forces prepare for the offensive, but nobody knows when and where it will start. The only thing we know, it will happen soon, as soon as we have firm ground for the heavy tanks to pass through and enough ammunition to push the enemy back to Russia. Before the start of the offensive, Ukraine started gradual preparation for the logistical paralysis of the entire Russian army in the Azov region. In this context, let's recall the words of John Pershing again. Infantry wins the battle, logistics bring the victory to the war. That is, once again, we see that a lot of attention is paid to logistics. Currently, the accumulation of logistical capabilities of the Ukrainian army continues, which, is my opinion, indicates that the offensive will definitely takes place soon. Also, I think most likely there can be several blows in different directions and somewhere one big blow. You will ask where can the distraction should be? Well, for example, in my opinion, it can be in the direction of the city of Kurchatov, the Kursk region in the Russian territory. I think there may be some kind of blow in this direction because this city is located less than 100 kilometers or approximately 60 miles from the border with Ukraine, and two major roads from that city lead to Ukraine. It will be very easy to get there when something happens, right? Well, if something like this happened, of course, most of the Russian army will rush there to protect the Skurchatov city or provide the alternative pathways for its troops and supplies, or wait to save themselves. Well, after such a distracting blow, it will be possible to head south to the Azov region. Logistics is the most important, of course, both for Ukrainian and the Russian army. That's why lately we've been seeing giant caravans with trucks there in the Azov region. Moreover, not military, but already civilian trucks for the delivery of necessities for the creation of defensive lines to the Azov region. They are very afraid that the Ukrainian offensive will continue there. This line of defense requires a huge amount of all kinds of resources: the concrete pyramids and concrete shelters, and they deliver all that using just the regular trucks. It seems to me that Ukrainian command and the saboteurs should definitely pay attention to the need to disable the civilian trucks, which are involved in supplying the occupying army with everything they need. By the way, we can also put pressure on the European Union to introduce a total ban on the trips of those trucks to the Europe that using all their force to supply invaders. Perhaps under the threat of the total ban on trips to the EU, these trucks drivers will refuse to participate in such events. Well, in general, of course, the destruction of Russia's ability to transport goods in the Azov region is very important. These trucks must be damaged. Indeed, a big plus is that there is only one decent highway along the Sea of Azov, and it is in constant traffic jams. What it means? It means the supply of weapons, ammunition for the Russian forces are going through the bottleneck. Recently, a smart decision was made. A series of strikes were carried out on the locomotive depot in Melitopol. The Melitopol is a Ukrainian city that was occupied in the first couple of weeks of war. That is, if you burn those locomotives, the system of the repair and maintenance, then the supply will be even more disrupted around already from Crimea, because everything goes from Crimea to Melitopol, which is occupied by Russians, by railway, and from Melitopol to Russia and other Ukrainian cities. So, so basically, by distracting that Melitopol depot, the logistics of Russian Federation will be totally distracted. By the way, there is another interesting news. Russia cannot produce new trucks anymore due to a lack of components they import from the European Union. If Russians totally block from Europe and sanctions applied accordingly, it is possible to make the normal logistics of the Russian army in the Azov region impossible. I understand that preparation for the logistical paralysis of the entire Russian army in the Azov region are slowly underway. This very logistics is systematically being knocked out. Well, it's a warm up after all, and on the day when Ukraine starts the offensive, when the blow will absolutely blow on that region will be totally devastating. Using glide bombs, long range missiles, and more, for this purpose, the Americans are supplying them now. I believe that this is how it will be. Of course, there will be an offensive. Because now there is so much talk about this offensive that maybe it's some kind of military trick and it won't happen. I don't know what will happen then, but maybe it's the strategy will be changed. Maybe Ukraine armed forces will do something different, but definitely it's coming. We know it's coming. And we all know the war continues. Ukraine is accumulating weapons and firing a minimal number of artillery shells. At the same time, Russia is throwing all of its forces into attempt to break our defense lines, but the strength of enemy's attacks is diminishing. Moreover, the enemy continues to find a way to escape defeat and come up with new strategies. According to the soldiers currently fighting at the front lines of Bakhmut, the Ukraine armed forces keep grinding through Russians, but not at full strength, unfortunately. The order was given to conserve artillery shells and fire only a limited number of them, just enough to hold the front. It seems like the Ukraine commander strategy is to accumulate enough resources for the future offensive campaign. This is almost certainly because Ukraine doesn't want the same outcome as we had after the Kharkiv offensive last year, when we were forced to stop pushing the enemy due to limited resources and allowed the invaders to regroup and build new defensive lines, which they still hold as of today. Russia's strategy is changing. In the last week, the number of attacks in Bakhmut Avdiivka decreased by two-thirds. The enemy doesn't attack as much as it was in March. Instead, the enemy has concentrated its forces on building lines of defense far from front lines. Moreover, the satellite images show that Putin's army has been digging trenches in the Crimean Peninsula at a very high speed over the last 30 days. Furthermore, Russia has intensified its preparations to evacuate civilians to Crimea from the occupied parts of Ukraine's southern Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Every attempted Russian method and strategy have not worked and most likely will not. Without achieving their stated goals, Putin has only one remaining goal: for the war to last as long as possible. Only a frozen conflict will allow him to hold his power. If he loses the war, he might lose this power immediately. After over 20 years holding the power, he truly doesn't want to lose it. Thank you for listening our podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends and listen to our earlier podcasts.